The cold marble bit through the thin fabric of her uniform, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Zora knelt, her fingers tracing the sharp, carved edges of the Korean characters on the headstone. The scent of damp earth and fallen ginkgo leaves was thick around her, a perfume of memory and decay. Her work was done for the day. The other stones in this quiet, wealthy section of the cemetery gleamed with her labor, but this one was different. This was not work. This was a debt. A single tear escaped, hot against her cool skin, and she wiped it away with the back of her wrist. She carefully arranged the bouquet she'd brought, a burst of crimson and white roses against the severe gray granite. Red for the blood he shed, white for the peace he had given her. She didn't know the man buried here, not really. She only knew his name, Kang Min-jun, and the impossible kindness he had shown a terrified, lost young woman 5 years ago on a rain-slicked Seoul street. A kindness that had cost him his life. The memory was always sharp, a shard of glass in her mind. The alley, the glint of a knife, her own strangled scream. And then him, an older man in a fine coat, stepping out of the shadows not with fear, but with an authority that seemed to bend the air around him. He had spoken in a low, calm voice, and the confrontation was over before it began. He had walked her all the way to her tiny apartment, ensuring she was safe, never once asking for a thing in return. 2 days later, his face was in the newspapers. A victim of a gangland dispute, she had found his final resting place and had been coming here ever since, a silent guardian to the memory of the only person who had shown her grace in this sprawling, indifferent city. Another sob caught in her throat. She pressed her forehead to the cold stone, letting the grief wash over her. That's when she felt it. A change in the atmosphere. A sudden drop in pressure, as if a storm front had rolled in without a sound. The birds in the nearby trees went silent. Slowly, she lifted her head. She didn't turn. Her eyes focused on a reflection in the polished surface of the marble. A figure stood behind her, tall and utterly still. He was a silhouette of impossible wealth and danger. The reflection showed the perfect cut of a charcoal gray suit, a fabric so fine it seemed to drink the light. She forced herself to breathe, to turn. Her gaze started at his shoes, impeccably polished black leather that cost more than her rent for a year. They made no sound on the soft grass. Her eyes traveled up the flawless line of his trousers, past a long, dark overcoat that fell to his knees. His hands were at his sides, one gloved in black leather, the other bare. Long, elegant fingers. A heavy, understated silver ring on his 4th finger. Finally, she made the mistake of looking up into his face. It was a face carved from the same granite as the tombstone before them. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, eyes that were not black, but a shade of brown so dark they seemed to hold no light at all. He was younger than the man in the grave, but he had the same aura of absolute control. He was watching her, not with curiosity, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask what she was doing. He spoke 2 words, his voice a low, chilling whisper that was more command than question. "Explain yourself." Zora's heart hammered against her ribs. She rose to her feet, her movements stiff. She smoothed down the front of her light blue cleaner's dress, her fingers fumbling with the ties of her white apron. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I was just paying my respects." His eyes flickered to the roses, then back to her face. The lack of expression on his features was more terrifying than any anger would have been. "Respects? You do not know this man," it was a statement of fact. "I do," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. He helped me. A long time ago. He saved me." A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only sign of any reaction. "My father," he said, the words clipped and precise, "was not in the business of saving people." The world tilted. His father. This cold, lethal man was the son of the kind stranger who had walked her home. It didn't seem possible. They were night and day, a shadow and a memory of light. "He was kind to me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I never forgot it." The man, Kang Dae-hyun, as she now knew he must be, took a step closer. The air crackled with his proximity. He smelled of cedar and cold winter air. Kindness is a liability, a currency for fools. Whatever you think you know about him, you are mistaken. Now leave. This is a private matter. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and flee this place, to forget this man and the grave that tied them together. But she couldn't. She had tended this memory for 5 years. It was hers, too. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, standing her ground. That was when she saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, but something colder. Contempt. "You are sorry for my loss," he repeated, the words laced with a subtle, dangerous irony. He was about to say more, to dismiss her, to erase her from his presence, when the sound came. A soft thud from the cemetery road. Then another. Dae-hyun didn't look. His entire body went rigid, his focus sharpening on something beyond her. He moved with a speed that was inhuman. One moment he was standing before her, the next his hand was on her arm, his grip like steel. He pulled her down, hard, behind the massive granite headstone of his father's grave. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice no longer a whisper, but a blade. The world erupted. The distinct, terrifying crack of gunshots split the sacred silence of the cemetery. Dirt and stone chips exploded from the monument just inches above her head. Zora cried out, pressing herself against the cold earth. Dae-hyun's body covered hers, a shield of tailored wool and solid muscle. The weight of him was absolute, pinning her to the ground, his scent filling her senses. She could feel the steady, controlled beat of his heart against her back. He was not afraid. He was alive. He shifted, pulling a sleek, black pistol from inside his coat. The movement was fluid, economical. He peered around the edge of the stone, and the world fell into a terrifying rhythm. The crack of incoming fire, the deeper, more authoritative boom of his own weapon answering. It was a language he was born speaking. Zora squeezed her eyes shut, her mind reeling. The kind man's son. A world of violence she had only ever read about in headlines was now pressing her into the dirt, the smell of gunpowder stinging her nostrils. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it began. The squeal of tires faded into the distance. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It was filled with the scent of cordite and the echo of death. Dae-hyun did not move for a long moment. He remained over her, his breathing even, his body a tense line of coiled energy. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up. He looked down at her, his face an unreadable mask. There was a thin scratch on his cheekbone, beading with a single drop of blood. "You saw their faces," he stated. It wasn't a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He extended a hand to her. It was the one that had held the gun, the bare one. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. His skin was warm, his grip firm as he pulled her to her feet. His men were appearing now, ghosts in black suits emerging from behind other tombstones, their movements silent and coordinated. They secured the area with a chilling efficiency, their faces blank. Dae-hyun did not release her hand. His dark eyes scanned her from head to toe, checking for injury. "You are a liability," he said, his voice flat. A loose thread, he turned to one of his men. "Clean this up. No trase." Then he looked back at her, his grip tightening slightly on her hand. "You're coming with me." It was not a request. It was a verdict. Her life as a quiet, invisible cleaner was over. That was the moment everything changed. She had come to honor a debt to a dead man, and in doing so, had become indebted to his dangerous son. The door to her old world had just been locked, and he was the one holding the key. The ride to his penthouse was silent and surreal. Zora sat beside him in the back of a black sedan with windows so dark they turned the vibrant city of Seoul into a muted, gray landscape. The car moved with an unnatural smoothness, gliding through traffic that seemed apart for it. Dae-hyun stared out his window, his profile sharp and unforgiving. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the cemetery. Zora's mind raced, trying to process the violent shift in her reality. One minute, she was mourning a ghost. The next, she was the prisoner of a man who moved through gunfire like it was his natural element. His penthouse was exactly what she would have expected. A monument to cold, hard power. It occupied the entire top floor of a skyscraper overlooking the Han River. The walls were glass, the floors polished black marble, the furniture sparse and brutally modern. There was no art, no photographs, no personal touches. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress, a perch from which a predator watched his territory. He led her to a stark living area and finally released her wrist. The skin was red where he'd held her. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a low leather sofa. He walked to the vast window, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the glittering cityscape. "Tell me again," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "About my father." She swallowed, her throat dry. "There's nothing more to tell. It was 5 years ago. I was new here, I didn't speak the language well. I got lost in Myeongdong. 2 men cornered me in an alley. Your father, he stopped them. He walked me home." "He walked you home," Dae-hyun repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. He turned around, his eyes boring into her. "My father did not take walks. He did not intervene in street crime. He built an empire that fed on the weakness of men like those who cornered you. What you describe is not the man I knew." "I don't know what to tell you," she whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. "I only know what he did for me." Dae-hyun's gaze was relentless. He was searching for a lie, an angle, a weakness he could exploit. "Who sent you? Was it my uncle? Are you a reporter? A police informant?" "I'm a cleaner," she said, a spark of defiance in her voice. "I clean the graves at that cemetery. That's all." He fell silent, studying her. She could feel his intelligence like a physical force, dissecting her, analyzing every flicker of her expression. That's when he let something slip, a crack in his glacial facade. "My father's only act of kindness was a betrayal," he said, his voice low and laced with a bitterness, so profound it seemed to poison the air. "He trusted his brother. My uncle. He brought him into the heart of the family, and that trust cost my mother her life. She was taken from us because of who he was, because of a weakness he mistook for loyalty. He never saved anyone. He only created victims." His wound was suddenly laid bare. The one vulnerability he carried. It was not his father's death that haunted him, but his mother's. A woman he failed to protect, a loss directly tied to the very man Zora remembered as a savior. Her story of a gentle stranger was an insult to the brutal reality of his own past. A phone buzzed, and one of his lieutenants, a man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, entered the room and spoke to Dae-hyun in a low, urgent tone. Dae-hyun's expression hardened, if that was even possible. He listened, then gave a curt nod. The lieutenant glanced at Zora, his eyes cold and dismissive, before exiting. "The men who attacked us were from the Jakael clan," Dae-hyun said, his attention back on her. "My uncle's faction. They saw you. They now know a woman was with me at the grave. They will not stop until they find you." The danger she was in crystallized. She was no longer just a witness to a crime. She was a target, a loose end his enemies would be eager to tie up permanently. Her quiet, anonymous life was gone, burned away in a handful of seconds by a burst of gunfire. Later, hidden in a guest room that was larger and more luxurious than her entire apartment, she overheard voices from the main living area. The lieutenant was speaking, his tone insistent. "She's a risk we cannot afford. We don't know who she is or what she wants. A civilian witness is a liability. We should handle it before they get to her." The silence that followed was terrifying. Zora's blood ran cold. She knew what handle it meant. She leaned against the door, her ear pressed to the wood, straining to hear Dae-hyun's reply. But there was nothing. He was considering it. In his world, a life like hers was expendable, a piece to be sacrificed to protect the king. Panic clawed at her throat, but something else rose with it. Anger. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pawn to be swept off the board. She straightened up, took a deep breath, and opened the door. She walked back into the living room. Both men turned, surprised. The lieutenant looked furious at her intrusion. Dae-hyun's face was unreadable. She walked right up to him, her chin held high. "You want to get rid of me because you think I'm a liability," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "But you're wrong. I'm not a liability. I'm an asset." The lieutenant scoffed. "An asset? You're a cleaner." "I'm observant," she shot back, her eyes locked on Dae-hyun. "I notice things people overlook. It's my job." She took a breath. "The car they used. A black Genesis. Your men already know that. But they probably don't know about the decal on the rear passenger window. It was small, a silver wolf's head, howling. It was custom, not a manufacturer's mark. That's how you'll find them." Silence. The lieutenant stared at her, his contempt replaced by a flicker of shock. Dae-hyun's gaze intensified. He had been there in the middle of a firefight and he hadn't seen it. But she had. Huddled on the ground, terrified for her life, she had noticed a detail that could break the case open. She had made a choice. She could have stayed in the room, waiting for her fate to be decided. Instead, she had walked out and demanded her right to survive, proving her worth in the only language they understood: information. She chose to stay, to help, to become part of the solution instead of the problem. Dae-hyun dismissed his lieutenant with a flick of his wrist. The man left, closing the doors behind him, leaving them alone again in the cavernous room. "You are surprising," Dae-hyun said. It was the closest thing to a compliment he was capable of. It was only then that she noticed the dark stains spreading on the side of his pristine white shirt, just below his ribs. "You're hurt," she said, her focus shifting. He glanced down, dismissing it. "It's a graze. It needs to be cleaned," she insisted. "Or it will get infected." Before he could protest, she went to the minimalist bathroom, found a first aid kit, and returned. "Take off your jacket and your shirt." He watched her, a strange expression on his face, a mixture of annoyance and something else she couldn't name. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, with a sigh of resignation, he shrugged off his overcoat and his suit jacket, pulling his firearm from its holster and placing it on a glass table with a heavy, definitive click. He unbuttoned his shirt, his movements precise. The wound was a nasty gash, bleeding sluggishly. The skin around it was already starting to redden. Zora's old instincts from her 2 years of nursing school kicked in. She worked efficiently, her hands steady as she cleaned the wound with antiseptic. The sting of it made him flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his abdominal muscles. He was all lean muscle and taut skin, marked by the faint, pale lines of older scars. The space between them shrank. She was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The scent of him, cedar, antiseptic, and something uniquely masculine, filled her senses. She was acutely aware of his stillness, of the way he watched her, his dark eyes tracking the movement of her hands. She finished dressing the wound, her fingers brushing against his warm skin as she secured the bandage. Her touch was professional, but in the charged silence of the room, it felt intimate, dangerous. Her eyes met his. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. For the first time, she saw something in his gaze that wasn't cold calculation or suspicion. It was a flicker of something human. He looked down at her hand, which was resting near the bandage. He noticed the small, silvery scar on her knuckle, a remnant of a childhood accident. He opened his mouth as if to ask, but then closed it, pulling his armor back into place. But the moment had happened, a connection forged in violence and sealed with a quiet act of care. It was the first, undeniable sign that he was beginning to see her not as a liability, or a cleaner, or a ghost from his father's past, but as Zora. Just Zora. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. The Silver Wolf decal was the key. It led Dae-hyun's men to a nondescript auto body shop in a gritty industrial district on the outskirts of Seoul. It was a known front for the Jokael clan. Dae-hyun decided to go himself, with a small, elite team. He told Zora to stay in the penthouse, where she would be safe. She refused. They're hunting me, she argued, her voice firm. I'm not going to hide like a frightened child while you fight my battle. I saw the decal. I should be there. He studied her for a long moment, his face impassive. She expected him to refuse, to lock her in the room. Instead, he gave a single sharp nod. Stay in the car. No matter what happens. The garage was quiet when they arrived, deceptively so. Daehyun's men moved like shadows, securing the perimeter. He got out of the car, his hand resting on the gun beneath his jacket. He looked back at her one last time, his eyes conveying a silent command.
Stay.
She watched as they breached the entrance, disappearing into the dark maw of the building. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, a deafening explosion ripped through the structure, shattering the windows and sending a plume of fire and black smoke into the night sky. It was a trap. Zora's heart stopped. She threw the car door open, ignoring his order. Debris rained down around her as she ran toward the burning building. Daehyun, she screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the flames. Chaos erupted. Jakael soldiers poured out from an adjacent building, firing on Daehyun's men as they scrambled from the wreckage. It was an ambush. In the confusion, a large, burly man with a cruel face spotted her. He broke from the firefight and lunged, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her back toward the shadows. She fought, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. He clamped a hand over her mouth, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. Through the smoke and flashing lights, she saw Daehyun emerge from the garage, soot-stained and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but alive. His eyes swept the scene, and then they found her. For a split second, the cold, controlled mask he always wore shattered. She saw a raw, primal fury in his eyes, a look of sheer terror that stunned her. He thought he was about to lose her. That single, unguarded moment changed everything. He moved. He was no longer a tactician, he was a force of nature. He cut a path through the firefight with a singular, terrifying purpose. Her. The men between them fell with surgical precision. He reached her captor, and the fight was brutally short. A flash of steel, a choked cry, and she was free. The man crumpled to the ground. Daehyun grabbed her, pulling her against his chest. His arms were like steel bands around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. His heart hammered against her, a wild, frantic rhythm. He wasn't checking her for injuries with detached concern. He was clinging to her, his breath ragged against her hair. It was the most raw, unguarded emotion she had ever seen from him. His men were winning the fight, the ambush turning against the Jakael. In the aftermath, they found one of the attackers still alive, pinned under a collapsed beam. It was the man who had grabbed her. He was begging for his life, his words a desperate, gurgling plea. Daehyun stood over him, his face dark with a cold rage, his gun in his hand. He was going to execute him. Zora looked at the man's terrified face, and she felt no pity. Only the ghost of the man's foul breath on her skin, the memory of his bruising grip. She saw a length of twisted rebar lying on the ground nearby. She bent down, picked it up, its weight heavy and real in her hand. She walked to Daehyun and held it out to him. Her own hand was perfectly steady. "He saw my face," she said, her voice quiet and clear in the sudden lull. "He knows I can identify them." Daehyun looked from the rebar to her face. He saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw choice. She was no longer an innocent civilian dragged into his world. She was an active participant. She had crossed a moral line she could never uncross, choosing survival, his survival, their survival, over the principles of her old life. He didn't take the rebar. He didn't need it, but he understood the gesture. He gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of her allegiance, before turning back to the business at hand. Back in the sterile silence of the penthouse, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a heavy exhaustion in its wake. Daehyun stood at the window, staring out at the river of lights that was Seoul at night. He had showered, and the cut on his forehead was now a stark red line against his pale skin. Zora stood a few feet behind him, wrapping her arms around herself. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of the explosion, the memory of his panic, the weight of her choice. "You should have been afraid," he said finally, his voice low, not turning to look at her. "I am," she answered, her voice just as quiet. "But not of you. Not anymore." That made him turn. His dark eyes were intense, searching hers. "That is your mistake," he said, the words a low growl. "Everyone should be afraid of me." She shook her head, a small, sad gesture. "I saw your father save a stranger. I think there is more to your bloodline than violence." He moved then, closing the distance between them in 2 silent strides. He stood before her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "My world destroys everything it touches," he confessed, the words torn from him, rough and raw. It was a warning, but it sounded like a confession of his deepest fear. "It destroyed my mother. It will destroy you." "Maybe," she whispered, not backing down. "Or maybe I'm not as fragile as you think." The tension between them was a living thing, a magnetic pull that was impossible to resist. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She saw the decision in his eyes, the slight parting of his lips. But before he could, his phone chimed with a specific, urgent notification. He glanced at it, and the moment was broken. The coldness slammed back into place. He turned away, his jaw tight. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer. He simply turned the screen toward her. It was a news alert from a major media outlet. The headline read, "Kong Empire heirs foreign mistress, a police informant?" Below it was a grainy, long-lens photo of her, standing beside Daehyun, at his father's grave. His uncle had made his move. He hadn't just put a target on her back for his soldiers. He had put one on her for the entire world. Her name wasn't in the article, but her face was. Her anonymity, her past, her entire former life, incinerated in a single act of public warfare. She was no longer Zora, the cleaner. She was now, and forever, the woman belonging to Kang Daehyun. And his enemies were coming for her.